Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a time when sex wasn't about feelings, selfies, or what are we texts. No swiping, no romantic playlists, no personal boundaries in the way we know them now. It was community property, in a way, a ritual, a tool, a cosmic alignment, a survival mechanism, sometimes divine, sometimes deeply awkward, but almost never just yours. So yeah, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this timeline emotionally, or physically really. Things get intense, weird, and way too smoky for comfort. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That's the rule. Also, where are you watching from and what time is it? Drop it in the comments, I always check. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're crouched in the middle of an open clearing. The air is smoky, heavy with the scent of ash and human sweat. Not the kind of sweat you get from a flirty jog around the park, but the collective musk of 50 people who've been dancing and howling under the stars for hours. This is the Paleolithic era, somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago, and tonight is not just a party. It's survival dressed up in bone necklaces and body paint. Around you, bodies move in rhythm to drums, if you can call them that. Hollowed logs, skin stretched tight, fists pounding. There's a fire in the middle, cracking and spitting into the dark, and just beyond the light, figures appear and vanish. Everyone's in it. Grandmothers, adolescents, hunters with fresh cuts from the day's work. They don't do privacy here, or shame. Sex isn't something whispered about. It's just part of the cycle, like hunting, like fire, like death. No one's pairing off romantically. No moonlit walks or what are we conversations. Instead, tonight's ritual is about fertility, literally bringing the next generation into being. And it's not random. The tribe knows who's strong, who's ready, who's needed. Sometimes it's planned, chosen by elders or spiritual guides. Other times it's driven by pure instinct and the collective trance. Either way, you realize quickly, this isn't personal, it's tribal. And yeah, it's weirdly effective, because they're not doing this for love. They're doing it so their people don't disappear. A young woman is led into the circle, decorated with red ochre across her chest and face. She's flanked by two older women who chant softly, keeping her calm. This is her first ritual. Around her, others join, forming a pulsing, organic expression of life. And in that moment, it's not about individual pleasure or even consent in the modern sense. It's about harmony, power, and contribution to the survival of the group. You look at one of the elders, his hair in knots, his skin like weathered bark. He's watching with the solemnity of a priest. Because to them, this is sacred. Not sacred like a Sunday sermon with a clean-smelling pew. Sacred like lightning, wild and terrifying and necessary. A moment to commune with the forces they can't name. Forces that bring rain, health, and the next breath. Now here's the quirky bit. Archaeologists have found Paleolithic cave art that suggests these rituals were not only spiritual, but may have included symbolic sexual imagery. Stylized phalluses, exaggerated figures, even group scenes that hint at orgiastic ceremonies. Whether those were literal or artistic, who knows? Some scholars argue it was a way to teach or commemorate these moments. Others say we're just projecting our own modern obsessions onto charcoal lines drawn 30,000 years ago. The debate is still hot, or at least academically warm. But what we do know, they lived and died by the tribe. You didn't choose your sexual identity. You didn't get to opt out because of a bad day. Sex was labour, sometimes sacred labour, sometimes social duty. But rarely about you. It was birth control by infanticide and spacing out pregnancies based on seasonal survival. Nothing romantic about it. It was management, and occasionally madness. Some researchers have even floated the idea, controversial of course, that early human societies may have practiced forms of group parenting. Think, shared responsibility, shared lovers, shared outcomes. The child belongs to everyone, the parentage a flexible concept. Makes sense when you consider the fragility of life back then. If one hunter dies, another steps in. Love? That's a luxury. You wander out beyond the firelight now, away from the heavy rhythms, and look up. The sky is massive. Stars scatter across it like ash. There's no ceiling between you and infinity, no walls to hold in your thoughts. and in that darkness you feel the hugeness of the human condition back then. Everything is immediate: hunger, desire, death, and your body. Just a tool to push the species forward another few feet on the endless path, and yeah, sure, it's a little bleak, but also beautiful in its rawness. No labels, no institutions, no shame. Yet. That part's coming. Fast. But for now you sit with this. In a world where sex isn't personal, it's survival wrapped in ritual, it's sacred and smoky and definitely unsanitary. And you? You're just one more warm body in a rhythm much older than names. By morning, the fire has turned to a smouldering breath of heat on the earth, and the dancers, those who haven't collapsed under the stars, are curling into piles of furs or bare earth, limbs tangled like tree roots. You step carefully around them, your feet brushing ash and scattered bits of ceremonial things. Feathers, smooth stones, painted bark, bones. No one looks ashamed. No one's doing the sheepish walk of shame. Because last night, it wasn't a secret. It was strategy. You move with the tribe now, following a small group on a short migration toward better land. This time, it's early Neolithic, around 9,000 years ago, and the people are settling down. Farming is beginning. They're not just chasing herds anymore, they're planting seeds, building mud brick homes, crafting little fences for their goats, if you can believe it. Civilization is stretching its sleepy limbs, and with it, sex starts to shift too, but not in the way you'd expect. Here, in this new semi-settled world, you watch a woman press her hands into wet clay, shaping the curve of a pottery jar. Her child plays in the dust nearby. You assume, naturally, that the man working in the field is the father, but no one seems particularly interested in confirming that. In fact, paternity is still kind of a vague idea. It's not a conversation anyone's having over dinner. These early agricultural people still mostly treat birth like a gift from the gods, or the earth itself, not a direct result of individual male effort. Fatherhood, as a concept, isn't quite invented yet. Not personally, anyway. What matters more than love or desire is fertility. Not just the act of creating life, but the magic of it. You see it in their idols, those plump figurines with heavy breasts and hips, carved by firelight and held in hand during planting seasons. The earth is a womb. Women are the vessels. And sex? It's a necessary ritual to ensure the crops grow, the goats give milk, and the rivers keep flowing. Feelings? Completely optional. You hear the tribe elders speak of a woman who has never conceived. Bad luck, they say. Maybe the gods are angry. Maybe her body's not in balance. So they assign her to lie with a different man this season. No one is scandalized. There's no divorce, no heartbreak. The only goal is conception. Everything else is just noise. But here's the thing. This is also the moment in history where things start to tighten. Ownership begins to creep in. You feel it subtly, like a breeze changing direction. Now that people are settling, they have land, they have property, they want to know whose child inherits what. Suddenly the fog around paternity starts to thin, and with it sex begins its slow shift from a sacred communal act to something tracked, labelled, and eventually claimed. Still, you're not there yet. For now, you sit among these people and notice how relationships are practical, cooperative. A woman may have multiple partners across seasons. Children are raised communally. Roles are fluid, even if gender lines are emerging more strongly. And while pair bonding is becoming more common, especially for managing farms and resources, romance still isn't the driving force. There are no whispered sonnets or dramatic longing glances. You don't fall in love, you build a life. And then there's the quirky bit. Archaeologists have found Neolithic sites with dozens of burials, all in one place. DNA testing of remains from Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest urban settlements, reveals something wild. People weren't buried with their blood relatives. They were buried with their social group, people they lived with, shared homes with. Not necessarily people they were biologically related to. So what does that mean? Maybe the social unit mattered more than family ties. Maybe parenthood wasn't personal, it was structural. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scholars argue that we're misreading things, putting modern ideas onto old bones. Others say this is proof that early people were more collective in how they viewed intimacy and identity. You'll hear debates about matrilineal societies, goddess cults, even ancient forms of polyamory. But the data is hazy, the bones can't talk, and so much of this era is still guesswork. Educated guesswork, but still, the mystery lingers. What's clear, though, is that this was a world of immense cooperation, and intimacy, as strange as it may sound to modern ears, was often just another form of labour, or offering, or alignment with cosmic forces. There were no diaries filled with heartache, no love triangles unless they were perfectly practical triangles designed to maximise the chances of growing the village. It was functional, it was ritualised, it was survival, again. But it was also the first hint of something more individual beginning to sprout, very slowly, underneath. By the fire that night, someone sings a low, mournful tune. It's not a love song, it's a song to the moon, to the water, to the crops that need to rise. And the woman beside you, heavy with child, closes her eyes as if feeling the rhythm in her bones. She doesn't know or care who fathered the baby. She only knows that when it's born, the village will care for it. The gods, the ancestors, the fields, they'll all watch over it. And you'll be expected to help too. No questions asked. You lie back on a woven mat made of reeds, the ground still warm from the sun. The stars overhead haven't changed in thousands of years, but the world below is shifting. Sex is still not personal, not yet. But it's inching toward definition. Property is coming. Bloodlines are sharpening. The earth, once open and wild, is being fenced off, just a little. And soon, with it, so will the body. You're not in a village anymore. Now the land under your feet is baked brick and the air smells like burnt incense and sun-warmed stone. You're standing in the middle of a temple courtyard in ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer to be exact, around 3000 BCE. This is where civilization begins to look like civilization. Writing, laws, towers to the heavens. And nestled right in the heart of it all? Sex. Not hidden, not taboo, but sacred, strategic, and tightly woven into the fabric of the state. You hear chanting, slow, rhythmic. A procession of women moves through the temple gates, their feet bare, anklets jingling with every step. They wear fine linen, some with gold thread woven through, and their hair is plaited into complex, mesmerizing shapes. These women are not outcasts, they're not shamed, they're priestesses, and tonight they're preparing for one of the most important rituals in the entire calendar, sacred marriage. You're probably thinking, okay, maybe it's symbolic, like a play, some light candles, a few poetic readings. Not quite. In this world, the ruler of the city must marry the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, depending on the city and the year. The marriage is sealed not through a signature or a ring, but through ritualized sex with her earthly stand-in, the High Priestess. Yep, you heard that right. The prosperity of the land, the fertility of its people, the success of the ruler, all of it hinges on a very public, very formal act of intimacy. You're not watching from the shadows. No one's hiding. This is a civic event. Officials are present. Musicians play nearby. The temple courtyard is softly lit with oil lamps and draped in coloured fabrics. This isn't scandal. This is holy. And here's where it gets even more complicated. This isn't the only place sex happens inside these temple walls. Some women serve the goddess as sacred prostitutes, a term that has sparked centuries of confusion, mistranslation, and heated academic side-eye. According to some ancient texts and Greek accounts, these women offered themselves to temple visitors, not as a job, but as a divine duty. The sex wasn't personal, it was devotional. Each act was a tribute to the goddess, a physical way to access the divine. But here's the scholarly debate bombshell. Modern historians aren't totally sold on the idea of sacred prostitution. Some argue it's a misreading of cuneiform tablets, that the word hierodule didn't necessarily mean sex worker. It could have meant temple servant, or singer, or even just someone dedicated to divine work. Others insist the rituals happened but were rare, symbolic, and probably exaggerated by visiting Greeks with a flair for the dramatic. Still, standing here, you feel the energy of something powerful, something deeply rooted in belief and community. Whether the sex acts were literal or symbolic, the message is the same. Sex wasn't about personal intimacy. It was about cosmic alignment. It was infrastructure. And it gets even more layered. The state and temple weren't separate. The king ruled by divine favour, and rituals, including sexual ones, reinforced that connection. A child born from a temple ritual could be seen as special, even sacred. Lineage and legitimacy blurred. Bodies were not just vessels, they were contracts, with the gods, with the state, with history. You follow one of the young acolytes back into a quieter corner of the temple. There are clay tablets stacked in neat piles, a scribe hunched over a low table, stylus tapping out lists in wedge-shaped script. You peek over his shoulder, grain deliveries, offerings, and oddly enough, a tally of temple women. Their names, roles, duties, it's all tracked. Even here, where sex is spiritual, it's also administrative. Quirky fact time. Some of these ancient tablets include curses, yes, literal curses, written by women hoping to stop their lovers from straying. One reads like the world's oldest petty revenge fantasy. May he become weak in bed and full of sores. Not exactly romantic poetry, but it shows you that even in a world where sex is mostly ritual and political, personal feelings still bubble up. Jealousy existed, maybe even heartbreak. But love, as we think of it, isn't the point. No one's getting married because of butterflies in the stomach. Marriages are arranged between families to combine land, power, or wealth. Daughters are betrothed young, often barely out of childhood. Brides are given in exchange for goods, goats, grain, textiles. And once married, a woman's body is essentially transferred property. Her sexuality now belongs to the house she marries into. There's a law for everything: adultery, fertility, virginity. Some punishments are light, others, not so much. You walk past a tablet with the code of Ur-Nammu etched into it, a precursor to Hammurabi's famous laws. It outlines punishments for sexual crimes and violations, but it's clear the laws are more concerned with property rights than consent. If a woman's body is tied to her family's honour or her husband's legacy, then violating it is not just a personal offence, it's a financial one. And in this world, where writing is new and cities are rising like stone dreams from the desert, sex helps organise society. It determines inheritance, settles disputes, legitimizes rule, and strengthens divine bonds. Personal pleasure? Not really part of the agenda. As the night winds down, you walk the long outer walls of the temple. The sandstone glows gold under the moonlight. Inside, the rituals are still underway. You hear faint music, footsteps on stone, whispers you can't quite catch. This isn't a brothel. It isn't a love nest. It's something older, bigger and colder, if also somehow more awe-inspiring. You lie down on the temple steps, the stone warm beneath your back. In this world, sex isn't about you. It isn't about love. It's about gods and kings, grain and power, ritual and rhythm. You're just a node in the divine web, a vessel for something older than morality and far more organised than romance. You wake to the sound of sandals scuffing against polished stone and the faint rush of the Nile in the distance. This time, the light is softer, filtered through intricate latticework carved into massive temple walls. You're in ancient Egypt, around 1500 BCE, and the air smells like myrrh and honey-drenched bread. Everything here glows with gold, jewellery, walls, even the people seem gilded. But don't let the shimmer fool you. Beneath the linen and ritual lies a world where sex is intensely strategic and deeply unpersonal, especially when it comes to the elite. You're in the court of Pharaoh now, walking beside servants who fan the air and scatter petals along the path. Royalty doesn't just command armies here, they command bodies. Pharaohs are seen as living gods, and their sexual partners, often their sisters. Yep. Welcome to the next stage in the long, strange story of sex's system. The idea isn't gross to them, it's divine. The gods married their siblings, so the logic goes, and to keep the bloodline pure, so should their earthly avatars. So when Pharaoh takes his sister as a wife, it's not about romance, it's about dynasty. The union isn't private, it's a public reassurance that the divine order is intact, and the royal house remains untainted by common blood. But here's where things get even more tangled. Pharaohs don't just have one wife, they have a great wife, usually the official queen, plus a whole hierarchy of consorts, secondary wives and harem members. And no, the harem isn't some hidden sex palace, it's more like an administrative hub of potential wombs, staffed with noblewomen, foreign princesses and high-ranking concubines, whose main function is to bear children and secure alliances. Sex here isn't a scandal, it's diplomacy. You pass through the harem complex, shaded, quiet, filled with gardens and the sound of water trickling through carved channels. Inside, women write poetry, play music, tend to children. You might think they're prisoners, but that's not exactly right. Some are powerful, some have their own servants, Some are well educated and influence policy through their sons. But again, love? Rare. Passion? Maybe, but fleeting. Sex here is a lever, and the person pulling it usually isn't the one doing the actual pulling. Now let's take a sharp left into the world of ordinary people, because not everyone in Egypt lived wrapped in gold and incestuous expectations. Among the farmers and artisans, sex is still practical, but with a little more room for the human heart. Marriage is common. Most couples live in modest homes, raise kids and share labour. Affection exists. You see it in love poems scrawled on shards of broken pottery. One goes, "My heart flutters hastily when I think of you. It lets me not act sensibly." So yeah, someone back then had it bad. But even in these more relatable relationships, the personal is secondary to the social. A marriage isn't about soulmates. It's about forming a household unit that can survive floods, raise kids, and keep the food coming. If love grows in that space, great. But if not, the union still holds, because it serves its purpose. And here comes your quirky fact of the night. One ancient Egyptian contraceptive involved crocodile dung. Yep, women would mix it with honey and insert it like a barrier. Scientists debate whether it actually worked. Some say the alkaline properties might have had a slight spermicidal effect, while others argue it was just really, really optimistic. Either way, it tells you something. Even then, sex came with consequences, and people were actively trying to manage them. Now, back to the palace for a moment, because here's where things get wildly performative. Royal ceremonies often involve symbolic sexual imagery. There's one festival, called the Festival of the Pharaoh's Potency, where the king might reenact the moment of cosmic creation by, well, pleasuring himself into the Nile, publicly, to bless the waters. You're watching the crowd gather by the riverbank now, heads bowed, some with offerings, others just waiting to see if the gods will be pleased. Is this sex? Technically, yes. But again, it's not personal, it's mythic, it's symbolic. The body isn't private, it's national infrastructure. Some scholars argue this ritual is exaggerated or misinterpreted by later historians, but others insist it's consistent with Egyptian creation myths, which often involve solo divine acts. And even if the act wasn't literal, the energy of it, sexual, generative, vital, was always central to the Egyptian worldview. To them, sex creates order from chaos. It's not dirty, it's cosmic. But here's where things get tricky. Women in Egypt had more legal rights than in many other ancient cultures. They could own property, initiate divorce, and act independently in court. Yet socially, their sexuality was still tightly regulated. A woman's virginity, especially among the upper classes, was a key piece of family honour. A married woman caught in adultery could be exiled or executed. Her lover, also in deep trouble, but you can probably guess the scales weren't always balanced. And if you're thinking about same-sex relationships, yep, those existed too. There's a famous tomb of two men, Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, depicted nose-to-nose in intimate poses usually reserved for married couples. Were they lovers, brothers, roommates with suspiciously close vibes? Scholars argue all three. The debate's still open, but the imagery, pretty clear. As the sun dips behind the papyrus marshes, you walk through the fields where workers return from a day of threshing grain. A man and woman lean into each other, laughing softly, hands coated in dust. Their connection feels more personal, more real, like a moment plucked from time. But it's not the norm, it's the exception. And you wonder, quietly, if even they think of their affection as something separate from the daily grind of duty and expectation. Tonight, you rest beneath a painted ceiling inside a temple chamber. Stars glimmer overhead, fake ones, gilded on stone, but they still comfort you. You've seen bodies turned into symbols, sex turned into statecraft, and desire swallowed by duty. And in all of it, one truth keeps surfacing. Here, sex is less about feeling and more about function. Divine, dynastic, or diplomatic. Never quite private. Never really about you. You're squinting now because the sun is high and blinding, bouncing off white marble columns and gleaming bronze armour. You've landed in ancient Greece, somewhere between 500 and 400 BCE, and everything smells like olive oil, sweat and ideas. Big ones, democracy, philosophy, tragedy, and yes, sex again. But don't get too comfortable. This isn't a land of candlelit cuddles and mutual respect. Here, sex is intellectual, hierarchical, and, once again, not personal. At least not in the way you might hope. You're in Athens striding through the agora where merchants shout and philosophers mumble to themselves. Men in robes talk in circles while scratching their beards. A pair of them walk past you, one older, one younger. They're not father and son, they're probably not even related, but they're something else entirely. Erastes and Eromenos, lover and beloved. This is a recognised and even encouraged social relationship between a grown man and an adolescent boy, and before you throw your phone across the room, yes, it's deeply problematic, but also historically real, and disturbingly normalised at the time. This bond wasn't just sexual, it was educational. The older partner, the Erastes, was supposed to guide the younger through politics, philosophy and life. In return, the Eromenos offered admiration, companionship, and sometimes physical affection. This relationship wasn't about romance or even desire as we define it. It was status, prestige, a kind of mentoring by way of flirtation. And while not all such relationships involved sex, many did. You walk into a symposium now, a private drinking party for elite Athenian men. The room is dim, filled with music, laughter and reclining bodies. The air is thick with wine and smoke. Naked servants move between couches, and women, mostly heterae or high-class courtesans, entertain the guests with song, wit and conversation. These women are educated. They're not wives. They're companions. They can talk politics, quote poetry, challenge a man without being stoned for it. But still, their value is tied to how well they charm and entertain. Their job is to make men feel important. Now here's a strange twist. Athenian wives? They're not even invited to this party. They're at home, spinning wool, raising kids, and mostly staying invisible. In fact, respectable women were expected to be as hidden from public life as possible. One male writer even said the best reputation a woman could have was no reputation at all. If a woman was known for something, it meant she had failed to stay properly invisible. So, you have a system where men form deep, sometimes sexual, intellectual bonds with boys, flirt with educated courtesans for pleasure, and keep their wives essentially locked away for childbearing. Sounds emotionally fulfilling, right? And yet, sex was everywhere. Not just in practice, but in thought. You walk past a statue of Aphrodite, hips draped in stone fabric so thin it's nearly obscene. You glance at pottery with graphic images, threesomes, bestiality, group scenes, all painted in painstaking detail onto wine cups. No one bats an eye. This is art. This is culture. But here's the quirky fact of the night. Ancient Greeks had no single word for sexual orientation the way we do today. Their categories were based less on gender and more on the role played during sex. Active versus passive, dominant versus submissive. And for men, being passive was considered shameful, especially if they were adults. There's actually courtroom evidence of Athenian citizens accusing rivals of being womanly because they supposedly took the submissive role in sex. Reputation mattered, power mattered, pleasure secondary. Now, let's talk women, for real this time. Outside the heterae there were also pornai, lower-class sex workers, usually owned by brothel keepers and often exploited. The state taxed them, regulated them, and essentially acknowledged their existence as a kind of civic service. Married men could visit them without moral consequence. But the women? They were considered polluted, necessary, but shameful. There's an ongoing debate among scholars about how much agency women like the heterae really had. Some argue they were powerful, even influential in their own right. Others say that's wishful revisionism, and their power was always tied to male favour. It's probably both, depending on who and where. Either way, love, mutual, equal, emotional love, was not the standard here. Sex was a structure, a transaction, a layered mess of status, performance and public life. And here's something else. Plato, yes, that Plato, wrote about love as something higher than physical desire. In the Symposium, he floats the idea that physical attraction is just the first step on a ladder toward a purer intellectual love of the soul. That's right. Even he was trying to elevate things beyond bodies. But it's telling that he had to, because the culture around him was very much grounded in flesh. You walk now through a narrow street near the Acropolis, watching a young couple sneak a moment together in the shadows. A rare sight. They exchange a glance, touch fingers briefly, and part without a word. You realise for them, love is something private, something not yet claimed by public institutions, maybe even forbidden, a secret fire in a cold marble world. By nightfall, you're in a tiny home where a woman quietly sings her child to sleep. Her husband lies beside her, eyes already closed. There's no affection exchanged, no conversation, just duty, obligation, continuity. Sex, when it happens, is part of the household routine. Not a moment of intimacy, but a biological function with social consequences. And as you lie back on your own stone bench, looking up at stars that philosophers have probably already named, you start to get it. Sex here isn't personal, it's performative. It's a public act dressed in private skin. A performance of power, status, intellect, or civic participation. And in this theatre, no one's writing love letters. They're too busy trying to stay on the right side of the social script. The air is heavier here. The marble is grander, colder. And the smell? It's wine and sweat and roasted meat, laced with something sharper. You're in Rome now, ancient Rome, sometime around the 1st century CE. And if you thought Greece was intense, Rome is about to make it look like a middle school dance. This isn't just a culture that tolerates sex, it's one that builds monuments to it. Sex here is not just unpersonal, it's industrial, it's theatrical, it's weaponized. Welcome to the empire of indulgence. You walk through a crowded street, dodging carts, soldiers, beggars and merchants shouting in Latin. Signs carved into stone or painted on walls advertise bathhouses and brothels with crude little illustrations. No mistaking what's on offer. A man bumps into you, barely notices, keeps walking. He's in a hurry, probably late for an orgy, and not even a scandalous one. Just your standard Tuesday night gathering of senators and their favourite meretresses. The first thing you notice about Roman sexuality is the sheer scale of it. This is a culture obsessed with domination, not just over lands, but over bodies. Masculinity is defined not by who you sleep with, but by who you control. Sex is ranked by power, not orientation. The ideal Roman male is the penetrator. Physically, socially, politically. He takes, he conquers. His status is reinforced every time he asserts himself over someone lesser, whether that's a woman, a slave, or a lower-class man. You enter a domus, a wealthy Roman home where the master of the house lounges in a dining room, reclining on cushions, sipping wine from a silver goblet. At his feet, a young male slave fans him. This isn't scandalous, it's expected. Slavery is everywhere, and with it, a built-in class of bodies to be used at will. Consent as a concept is absent here. Sex between masters and slaves is common, constant, and legally invisible. These aren't relationships, they're acts of ownership. But even among free citizens, sex is wildly performative. You attend a feast later that night, convivium style. Plenty of food, wine, music, and games. As the wine flows, the rules loosen. One guest starts reciting erotic poetry. Another pulls out a crude little statuette and gets a round of applause. By dessert, a young couple is making out against a column while someone's grandmother claps along. No one blushes. Why would they? The Romans have gods for everything, including sex. Venus, of course, but also Priapus, the garden god with the famously oversized cymbal. There are household shrines featuring his permanently erect likeness, usually accompanied by a poem that reads like a locker room threat. Touch my fruit and I'll punish you with this. Very subtle. Quirky detail for you. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered an entire wall of graffiti, most of it deeply inappropriate, and also hilarious. Things like, I screwed the barmaid, Lucius was here, and Secundus likes boys. Pompeii was destroyed in 79 CE, but before that it was just another Roman city where sex was scrawled on the walls like a public Yelp review. You walk down those same stone streets now, and it's all still there, etched into history, crude, proud, and totally unashamed. Now let's talk women. In Rome, elite women are expected to marry young, manage households, and produce heirs. Marriage isn't about love, it's about alliances, family reputation, and political power. A Roman bride could be swapped out like a political chess piece if the tides turned. Her fidelity was expected. His, optional. That said, some women found ways to push back. You hear whispers about Clodia, the scandalous aristocrat who wrote poetry and took lovers freely, or Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, who allegedly competed in sex marathons with prostitutes. Are those stories exaggerated? Definitely. Are they rooted in panic about women stepping outside their assigned boxes? Absolutely. And that's where the scholarly debate starts to simmer. How much of what we know about Roman women's sexuality is truth, and how much is male panic scribbled in ink? Same-sex relationships. As in Greece, they existed, but the cultural framing was all about dominance. A high-status man could take a male lover, but only if he was the dominant partner. To be on the receiving end was a social death sentence unless you were a slave, in which case, again, your consent didn't matter. So sexual activity was less about orientation and more about maintaining social hierarchy. Being a man didn't mean having sex with women. It meant never being submissive, ever. Even their gods had complicated sex lives. Jupiter was constantly shapeshifting to seduce mortals, once as a swan, another time as golden rain. The myths are full of assault and trickery, but they weren't moral tales. They were just stories, reflecting a world where power and sex were hopelessly tangled. Now, here's the slightly horrifying part. Roman law was brutal. Adultery by a woman could result in exile or execution. But a man, as long as his partner wasn't married or a freeborn Roman male, he was in the clear. Rape of a slave? Not even a crime. It wasn't considered rape if the victim wasn't a citizen. Imagine the paperwork. But somehow, in all this chaos, there were still gestures of affection. You see a carving in a villa, two lovers holding hands, smiling, a small thing, possibly a fluke. Or maybe love slipped in through the cracks like sunlight through curtains. But love, here, was optional. Status was everything. As the party winds down, you find yourself in a bathhouse. The heat is thick, the steam rising from the pools like ghosts. Bodies move around you, chatting, grooming, relaxing. And yes, sometimes more than relaxing. Bathhouses were centres of gossip, politics, and yes, sex. But even here, it's not romantic, it's recreational, transactional, practical. You lie back on the warm stone, eyes closed. Around you, the empire hums. Aqueducts carry water across miles. The army conquers new lands, and Rome swells with wealth, cruelty, and decadence. And at its core, sex pulses. Not as love or intimacy, but as power, performance, and possession. It's not about connection, it's about control. You're not in the city anymore. You've stepped out of the forums, villas, and bathhouses and into something far more secretive. Darker, quieter. You're in a candlelit cave now, the kind with carvings etched into damp stone and the scent of burning herbs curling in the air. This isn't a temple or a palace. It's a ritual site, a place of mystery cults, where initiates come to experience something raw and cosmic. And yes, sex is here too. Still not personal, but now it's mystical, divine, sometimes terrifying. Welcome to the undercurrent of ancient religion, where the body meets the gods in ways official histories don't always like to mention. You watch as a procession moves through the cave, each person wrapped in loose robes, barefoot, eyes lowered. They chant in a low, humming rhythm that seems to vibrate the stone itself. You've entered a rite of the cult of Dionysus, or maybe Cybele, or Isis. Hard to tell, really. These cults borrow and remix each other constantly, blending Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Persian traditions into something new and half-forbidden. What they all share is ecstasy, literal and spiritual. To be in these rites is to shed the self, to dissolve into something larger, more primal. In the centre of the cavern, there's a performance beginning. Dancers, both men and women, move in spirals, their bodies painted with symbols, their limbs wild and loose. The music is frantic now. Drums, pipes, something like wailing. And in that sound, you realise what this is. It's not entertainment, it's transformation. The initiates aren't just watching, they're being pulled into trance, into madness, into some place between the human and the divine. And then it happens. In the frenzy, some pairs break off, disappearing into alcoves. Others remain in the open. There is touch, moaning, tears, sex happening in shadowed corners, wrapped in ritual and hallucination. This isn't casual or pleasurable in the way Romans might indulge at a dinner party. This is possession. This is surrender. This is not about connection with another person. It's about connection with something far beyond people. One initiate collapses in a shaking heap, murmuring in an unknown tongue. Others cry or laugh or scream. The boundaries are gone. There is no I anymore. There is only the collective experience, the hive of flesh and breath, all of it offered up to some deity who is probably part wine god, part earth mother, and part fever dream. And here's the thing, none of this is illegal, not officially. These mystery cults are tolerated, sometimes even respected, though they make the political elite nervous, because they offer something outside the order, outside the structures of state, gender and control, and that's dangerous. Scholars still debate how sexual these rituals really were. Some say the ecstatic rites were purely symbolic, metaphors for spiritual union. Others insist the accounts of wild orgies and sacred prostitution are accurate, just inconvenient for the people who later wrote the official histories. The truth probably lives somewhere in between. There's enough evidence in art and text to suggest that sex, or at least simulated sex, played a key role in many of these ceremonies, not as pleasure, but as transcendence. Take the cult of Cybele, for example. Her priests, called Galli, were male devotees who ritually castrated themselves as an offering to the goddess, often in a state of trance. That's right. In a public ceremony, with music and drums and screaming crowds, they would remove their own manhood and dedicate themselves to her service. Afterward, they dressed as women and lived outside the traditional gender roles of Roman society. You want to talk about sex not being personal? This is sex taken to the absolute limit, cut away, literally, from the self. The Roman state tolerated the cult, but barely. Senators called it Eastern madness. They saw the whole thing as decadent, dangerous, un-Roman. And yet, people kept joining. Because something in those rites gave them what public religion, politics and family structure didn't. A sense of release. A way out of the rigid hierarchy of Roman life. A path, through pain, through trance, through sex or the denial of it, towards something divine. You sit on a stone ledge now, the ritual still echoing behind you. Someone screams, not in fear, but in revelation. Someone else sobs uncontrollably. Another lies completely still, eyes wide open. The cave feels alive. The gods, whatever they are, have been summoned, and you think back to the mainstream temples, the clean, cold architecture, the formal rituals performed by priests in polished robes. There, the gods are distant, wrapped in marble and incense. Here, they're in your lungs, your skin. They move through you. No hierarchy, no theology, just feeling, just surrender. Now for your quirky twist of the night. Some mystery cults required initiates to fast, strip, and lie in the dark for days before the rite began. In one cult tied to Dionysus, you might be blindfolded, made to crawl, or led through a series of erotic and terrifying sensory experiences designed to break you down. Only then would you be reborn, transformed by whatever unspeakable thing had just passed through you. Kind of like an ancient version of a music festival meets religious trauma therapy. And just when you think you've understood the pattern, the edge of it, you remember. You can't. That's why they're called mystery cults. You weren't supposed to understand, only experience. As dawn breaks, the initiates emerge from the cave slowly, blinking at the light. Some hold each other, some walk alone. No one speaks. You realize they've been through something enormous, sacred, scarring maybe, but binding. And in that bond, sex played a role, not to connect two people, but to connect humans to something they could not name. You lie back in the grass now, staring up at the morning sky, still tingling with residual sound and firelight. In this world, sex is not about want, not about love, not even about power. It's about losing the self, dissolving, being unmade and made again, and you, watching from the edge, feel just a little less human and a little more, whatever comes before language. It's hotter now, thick, humid, and fragrant in a way that feels like the earth is exhaling right into your face. You're standing barefoot at the base of a stone temple in India, somewhere around 900 CE. Everything around you breathes with life. Banyan trees stretch overhead, monkeys chatter in the branches, and incense coils like ghost smoke from a carved copper dish. But what draws your eyes, what freezes your breath, is the temple itself. Carved into every surface, every pillar, every wall are bodies, hundreds of them, locked in every position imaginable. And yeah, that kind of position. This is Khajuraho, one of the great temple complexes built by the Chandala dynasty. And no, it's not some ancient bachelor party souvenir. These carvings aren't secret. They're not hidden in back rooms or behind curtains. They're right out in the open, on sacred ground, covering the holiest spaces. And in this world, sex is sacred. Not just metaphorically, literally. It's cosmic, mathematical. It's the union of opposites, the energy that makes the universe go boom. And it's still somehow not personal. You step closer to the stone. A couple carved into the wall seems to float, suspended in timeless motion. Their bodies are idealized, curved, smooth, lithe. The expressions, not lustful, not dramatic, serene, joyful. Like the act they're frozen in isn't a sin or a scandal, but a form of prayer. And in a way it is. Because in tantric philosophy, sex isn't just physical. It's a key to unlocking higher consciousness. You're not just touching someone else's body, you're aligning your breath, your energy, your entire soul with the divine. Think yoga meets cosmic Wi-Fi, with significantly fewer clothes. You're ushered into the temple interior by a devotee in saffron robes. Inside, it's dim, cool, and thick with the scent of camphor and ghee. A priest chants mantras as a flame flickers in a bronze bowl. Everything here is symbolic. The yoni, the womb-like base of the altar, the lingam, the phallic pillar rising from it. Creation itself encoded into architecture. The whole structure is a metaphor for sex and the cosmos born from it. And the message is clear. There's no shame in creation. But don't get too romantic. This isn't about mutual orgasms and candlelight. It's ritual, discipline, and practice. In some tantric schools, couples would engage in prolonged, deliberate sexual rituals, guided by mantras, visualizations, and breath control. You weren't supposed to climax. You were supposed to transcend, to hover at the edge of desire without tipping over. Pleasure wasn't the goal, transcendence was. Which, let's be honest, sounds like a lot of work. But these people were committed, and here's where it gets even more layered. Not all of India was practicing Tantra, and even within Tantra, not all paths included sex. There's fierce debate among scholars about how widespread these erotic rituals really were. Some say only a tiny elite, cloaked in secrecy, engaged in them. Others argue it was more common but misunderstood by colonial-era translators, who saw ancient statues and assumed a 1,000-year-old orgy. Spoiler, colonial prudery didn't help clear things up. Still, those carvings, they exist. In stone. Hundreds of them. With enough creativity to put most adult websites to shame. They weren't decoration. They were theology. And they weren't even the risque part. Here's your quirky fact for the night. In some schools of Tantra, practitioners believed that swallowing bodily fluids was a sacred act. Yes, that kind of bodily fluid. These were considered powerful, divine substances capable of transformation when consumed in the right ritual context. Forget smoothies. This was ancient cosmic energy in a cup. It was all about balance, of the male and female, the physical and spiritual, the real and the symbolic. But while temples like Khajuraho celebrated eroticism, daily life outside these stone walls was more conservative. Women's sexuality was tightly managed within caste systems, family honour codes, and social expectations. Virginity mattered. Marriage was often arranged, and once married, a woman's sexual life belonged more to her husband's lineage than to herself. Temple dancers, divadesis, sometimes served gods through ritual sex, but even their roles were later distorted, misrepresented, and eventually banned under British rule. The personal was rarely prioritised over the spiritual, or the political. Even now, you're watching a young bride led to her wedding ceremony. Her sari is bright red, heavy with embroidery. She walks slowly, her head bowed, flanked by family on all sides. She's been raised to see sex not as an individual exploration, but a duty, a ritual act that binds her to her husband, his household, and generations before her. There might be love, there might be desire, but those are bonuses, not the point. At night, you lie on the stone floor of the temple, watching fireflies blink lazily outside. The carvings above you are still there, still frozen in time, men and women, gods and mortals twined together in sacred geometry. You think of all the places sex has gone in history so far. Ritual, regulation, transaction, trance. And now, here, you find a version that's the most spiritual and the least personal yet. Because in Tantra, even your identity is an illusion. There's no you to want something. There's only energy, rising and falling like breath, waiting to be aligned with the rhythm of the universe. And your body? It's not your own. It's a vessel, a bridge, a tool for awakening, or at the very least an extremely decorative metaphor. Now the air shifts, lighter, drier, with a scent of silk and ink and burning sandalwood. You're in China, sometime during the Tang dynasty, around 800 CE. Everything here moves with ceremony, from the way tea is poured to how a robe is folded. The streets of Chang'an bustle with poets, traders, monks and officials, all weaving through a city so cosmopolitan it hums with stories. And in these stories, sex isn't hidden. It's studied. Not romantic, not shameful, but vital, and once again, not exactly personal. You're standing in the private quarters of a scholar official. His room is spare but elegant. Scrolls line the walls, an inkstone rests beside fresh rice paper, and across the room, a young woman adjusts her hair in front of a bronze mirror. She's a courtesan, not a servant, not a prostitute in the way Rome or Greece would define it. She's a Kinglo woman, trained in poetry, music, dance, and the fine art of conversation. She doesn't belong to him, but she's here tonight, invited like one might invite a performance. Her presence, cultivated. Her charm, precise. And sex, if it happens, is less about passion than about energy. Specifically, the careful balance of it. You sit in the corner, unnoticed, as he opens a silk-bound volume of ancient Taoist texts. This isn't smut. This is medicine. Philosophy. The chapter headings read like a mix between a tantric manual and a workout routine. The art of the bedchamber, preserving the essence, controlling the flow. You quickly realise Taoist sexual practices are all about balance. Yin and yang, male and female, fire and water. It's not about who you love, it's about how you move energy. In this worldview, sex isn't just pleasure, it's health. A way to prolong life, protect the organs, and connect with the Tao, the natural order of the universe. The male body produces jing, or vital essence, and expelling it carelessly, red ejaculation, is seen as draining. The ideal man should have sex often, but climax rarely. Meanwhile, the woman's body is a wellspring of yin energy, so the more she enjoys herself, the more yang energy he can absorb. In short, he gets life points by pleasing her. The patriarchy is still intact, but at least there's an incentive to try. You sit in on a demonstration, or, let's be honest, a glorified date night between elite lovers. There are breathing techniques, eye contact exercises, rhythm control. They move slowly, like dancers, not rushing but circling one another. The woman guides as much as he does, and when it ends there's no climax in the Western sense, just breath, stillness, alignment. It feels like meditation that accidentally involves a mattress. Now for your quirky fact of the night. Some Taoist texts recommend specific positions based on the elements or seasons. Want to improve your digestion? Try the tiger leaps the gorge in autumn. Having memory problems? There's a pose for that too, usually with a poetic name and vague promise of enlightenment. It's like astrology meets Kama Sutra, but with strict breathing patterns and zero giggling. But outside these rarefied circles of scholars and elite lovers, things are more complicated. Marriage in Tang China is still a tool for consolidating family alliances. Romantic love exists in poetry. Sure, Li Bai and Du Fu could write verses that make your heart cramp. But in daily life, especially for women, sexuality is locked behind family expectation. A woman's virginity belongs to her parents. Her fertility belongs to her husband's lineage. If she's widowed, remarrying is frowned upon. If she steps outside her role, she becomes a cautionary tale. And yet, there's another layer here, because the Tang dynasty, for all its Confucianism, also has a streak of wildness. Women serve as poets, courtesans, even political players. You hear stories of Empress Wu Zetian, who rose from concubine to emperor, took lovers at her whim, and rewrote the script for female power entirely. Her sexuality was politicized, demonized, feared, but also undeniable. And while her enemies painted her as monstrous, her presence opened a strange door. What if a woman's desire wasn't just tolerated, but dangerous? You walk through a garden now, moonlight glinting off ponds filled with koi. A couple sits under a cherry blossom tree, quietly reciting lines of poetry to each other. The air is thick with unspoken rules, propriety, honour, lineage, but underneath it you feel a crackle. The longing is real, the tenderness is real, but the structures don't allow it to breathe freely. Love has to wear a mask of politeness. Sex, if it happens, is encoded, never confessed. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Some argue that Tang China was remarkably open-minded about sexuality, especially compared to what came later in more rigid dynasties. Others say that openness was restricted to the elite, and the rest of society remained tightly controlled. The truth, as usual, lives in the contradiction. You could be a courtesan with more freedom than a wife, a poet with a secret lover, admired by all but legally bound to none. Or you could be a peasant woman whose entire sexual life was dictated by childbirth cycles and family honour. As the night deepens, you find yourself back in the scholar's chamber. He's asleep now, and the courtesan sits alone, brushing her long hair, her reflection flickering in the lantern light. There's no shame on her face, no regret. She performed her role with elegance and care, and tomorrow she'll do it again. But this wasn't about love. It wasn't about her. It was a meeting of energies, of balances, of bodies, temporarily aligned under the guidance of philosophy more than passion. You lie on a bamboo mat in the corner, watching the shadows shift across calligraphy-covered walls. Here, sex is knowledge. It's a practice, a study. And like everything else in this society, it's beautifully structured and quietly restricted. Desire is mapped. Pleasure is regulated. Love, when it dares to speak, must do so in rhyme. The air turns colder now, sharp and still, like it's waiting for something. Gone are the incense clouds and open courtyards. You're in the shadows of stone cathedrals, narrow streets, and flickering candlelight. The year, somewhere around 400 CE and counting forward. You're in early Christian Europe now, where sex begins its long exile from the sacred into the realm of sin. This is the beginning of a whole new story. A quieter one, a heavier one. And for the first time, sex becomes deeply personal, but in the worst way possible. You walk into a small chapel tucked into a hillside village. The priest is mid-sermon, his voice solemn, almost whispering. Everyone around you listens with heads bowed, cloaks pulled tight, eyes flicking downward at any mention of the flesh. The message is simple and terrifying. The body is a temptation, a trap, a slippery slope straight to eternal damnation. And sex? It's the most dangerous pit of all. This wasn't always the Christian view. In fact, early Christianity was all over the map when it came to sex. Some sects embraced celibacy, others practiced ritual nudity, and believed true salvation came from overcoming shame entirely. But by the time the religion institutionalized, folding itself into the Roman Empire, it needed order, doctrine, control, and nothing gets people in line like telling them their deepest, most natural desires are poisonous. You sit in on a meeting of early church leaders as they hammer out doctrine. They're discussing things like whether it's a sin to have sex on Sundays, during Lent, during pregnancy, or simply if you happen to enjoy it. The verdict? Usually yes. The mood? Deeply unfun. St. Jerome famously wrote, "Anyone who is too passionate a lover with his own wife is an adulterer." You raise an eyebrow. So now it's possible to cheat on your wife with your wife. You jot that down just in case. The new ideal is celibacy. Virginity becomes a badge of holiness. Monks and nuns retreat into stone cells and forests, trying to starve the body into obedience. The desert fathers, early Christian hermits, report hallucinations of demonic women tempting them in their sleep. They whip themselves, sleep on stone, drink only water. Sex is now framed as a test, a weakness, a spiritual battlefield. But here's the thing, everyone's still doing it. They just hate themselves for it now. You hear confessions whispered behind heavy curtains. A man admits to impure thoughts. A woman speaks of her husband's roughness. A young girl fears she's possessed because she feels strange between her thighs. There's no medical vocabulary for this. No framework for healthy desire, just guilt, shame, and the constant reminder that God is watching, even in your dreams. Here's your quirky historical moment. Medieval manuals, written by monks, sometimes included wildly specific sexual sin taxonomies, like lying side by side was slightly less sinful than face to face, which was still less sinful than anything remotely enjoyable. Bonus sin points if you smiled, or if the woman took initiative. These were real discussions, at councils, with robes and candles and very serious Latin. Meanwhile, marriage becomes less about connection and more about containment. It's a concession. St. Paul literally called it better to marry than to burn, which is basically the spiritual equivalent of saying, fine, just get it over with. Within marriage, sex is tolerated, but only for reproduction. Pleasure, especially for women, is suspicious. In some regions, midwives were trained to temper female lust using cold compresses and holy water, because clearly the clitoris was a gateway to Satan. And here's where the debate among modern scholars gets spicy. Some argue that medieval sexuality was more nuanced than we give it credit for, that under all the sermons and statutes, people still found ways to experience pleasure, to love each other, to touch without turning it into a sin spiral. There are love letters, songs, even court records of affairs that suggest a rich, if hidden, emotional world. But officially, the line was clear. Sex is dangerous, women are dangerous, and the body must be controlled. You wander through a monastery at night. The corridors are silent, lit only by torchlight. Somewhere a scribe is copying a manuscript, maybe the Confessions of Augustine, who famously prayed, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." You can't help but smirk. Even the saints struggled. Even the holy men knew what it was to want, to wrestle, to fail. And then, in the chapel, you find something odd. A carved image of Adam and Eve, not just reaching for the fruit, but touching each other. Not lustful, just human. There's something tender in the way their fingers brush. For a moment, the shame lifts. You realise the Church's war on sex wasn't just about purity, it was about power. If they controlled your body, they controlled everything else. And intimacy. That was collateral damage. You fall asleep in the pews that night wrapped in candle smoke and ancient wood. Outside, wolves howl and the village sleeps. No one speaks openly about sex here. It lives in the margins, in whispers, in dreams, in confessions soaked with fear. And for the first time in history, the act itself has become personal, but in the loneliest way imaginable. Not shared, not sacred, just yours, and deeply wrong. You wake to the low tolling of a bell, slow and heavy like the heartbeat of some ancient giant. It's still dark, the kind of medieval dark that eats firelight whole. You're in the middle of Europe now, somewhere between the 9th and 12th centuries, depending on which abbey or muddy village you've wandered into. This is the age of monks and lords, of thatched roofs and plague rumours, and sex? Still very much off limits, but now it's not just suppressed, it's militarised, weaponised, and as always, not even a little bit personal. You're standing in the cloister of a monastery, where the walls echo with whispered prayers and the occasional guttural snore. A novice monk walks past you, eyes cast down, holding a text titled De Contemptu Mundi, the contempt of the world. You already know what's in it, that the world is a fallen place, that the flesh is corrupt, and that desire is the devil's hand puppet. If the early church planted the seeds of sexual shame, the medieval church just built an entire fortress around it. But here's the twist. Behind all that silence and sanctity, the world is boiling with tension. Because the more the church tries to suppress sex, the more obsessed it becomes with it. You see it in every sermon, every law, every trembling pamphlet warning against unclean thoughts. It's like medieval Europe decided the best way to defeat desire was to stare directly into it and scream for 600 years. You walk through a village square and see a preacher shouting about modesty. His voice is cracked, his eyes wild. A young girl nearby adjusts her dress nervously, as if she's personally responsible for leading half the congregation into temptation. This is how sex becomes everyone's business, but never anyone's choice. Women's bodies, especially, are now a battleground. A woman who laughs too loudly? Temptress. A woman who speaks her mind? Jezebel. A woman who does nothing at all but exists in public, still somehow guilty. You attend a trial next, not for theft, not for treason, but for a woman accused of witchcraft. Her real crime? Living alone, owning herbs, knowing how to help other women with birth, fertility, pain. Midwives, herbalists and widows are suddenly suspect, and sex, or the fear of it, is always involved. She lay with demons, someone whispers. You look at the accused. She's 60, toothless, shaking. But in the minds of these villagers, she's the embodiment of sexual chaos. The irony. Most of the people in this crowd haven't had healthy sex lives in decades, if ever. Here's your historical oddity. In the 13th century, manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum claimed witches could steal men's penises and keep them in bird nests. Real text, real panic. Apparently, nothing says we're in total control like accusing a woman of turning your junk into a garden ornament. You can't make this stuff up, except, well, they did. Meanwhile, the nobility has its own version of sexual repression, courtly love. You visit a castle, and everything's heavy with silk and longing. A lady in a tower receives a letter from a knight who's sworn to love her eternally without ever touching her. They make eye contact once across a banquet hall, and somehow that means they're soulmates. This is love without flesh, devotion without desire, or rather, desire that must always remain unfulfilled, because if you ever do anything about it, the whole fantasy collapses. Troubadours sing about this stuff like it's the height of emotional sophistication. You listen to one, he's got a lute, tragic eyebrows, and he's wailing about a woman he's never spoken to. This becomes the template for centuries of heartbreak. Idealize, pine, suffer, and if you're really lucky, die in battle before anything gets physical. It's passion turned into performance. And once again, no one gets to enjoy the actual act. That would ruin everything. But of course sex still happens. Behind castle doors, in haylofts under moonlight, peasants sneak into barns, nobles bed their servants, priests break vows in silent corners, and when it leads to scandal or pregnancy, the woman pays. Always. Laws are passed to punish fornication, but only one party ever seems to face the lash. You're in a village when a young woman is forced to walk through the square in shame, hair shorn, shoulders hunched. The man vanished, untouched. Still, despite all this regulation, the cracks keep showing. In illuminated manuscripts you find little marginal drawings of monks with erections, nuns flashing each other, animals engaged in deeply inappropriate behaviour. You ask a scholar about it later and he shrugs. Humour, he says, or maybe rebellion. Even in the margins of holy books, sex refuses to disappear. And here's the academic debate. Was all of medieval Europe this repressed? Or is that just how modern people want to imagine it? Some historians argue that under the surface there were plenty of communities with more relaxed attitudes, places where folk traditions and older pagan views still lingered, where sex was part of life, not a cursed obstacle course. Maybe. But what's clear is that in public, sex had become the enemy, and desire something to fear. At night, you walk the halls of a stone abbey. Wind howls through narrow windows and you swear you hear someone sobbing behind a wooden door. A monk? A nun? Someone caught in the war between the body and the soul. You lie down on a cold slab wrapped in a borrowed wool blanket and try not to think too hard. Because here, in this age, sex is no longer just a tool or a ritual. It's a sin waiting to happen. A temptation curled inside every touch, every glance. It's yours, but you mustn't want it. It's everyone's concern, but no one's right. And in trying to contain it, the world has turned it into a monster, one that lurks in dreams, in woods, in the eyes of anyone you're not supposed to love. Morning breaks slowly over damp stone and dewy grass, and you're walking through the walled courtyard of a medieval castle, past knights practicing sword swings and ladies stitching golden thread into cloaks they'll probably never wear. But tonight's story doesn't belong to them. It belongs to a quieter kind of madness, the kind that wears perfume, speaks in riddles, and writes poetry about someone they've never touched. You've stepped into the age of courtly love now, the high medieval fever dream where sex is romanticised, idealised, and, wait for it, almost entirely theoretical. You sit in the corner of a great hall watching a young troubadour compose his thoughts before performing. He plucks his lute like it's a nervous tick, muttering half-rhymes about eyes, roses, stars, and longing that will never be satisfied. When he starts to sing, the crowd falls into a hush, and you realise the woman he's serenading is sitting directly across from him, married, untouchable, and clearly flattered. This is the new game, love without consummation, desire as suffering, nobility expressed through unfulfilled passion. In the courtly world, the highest form of romance is worshipping someone from afar. And the rules? Absurdly strict. The lover must be of lower rank, the beloved must be married, and if they ever actually hook up, the whole fantasy implodes. So instead, they trade poems, secret glances, and the kind of hand-holding that would scandalise a Puritan. You sit in on a gathering of noblewomen discussing the art of love, quoting from The Art of Courtly Love, a 12th century guidebook by Andreas Capellanus. This thing is basically a medieval dating manual, but instead of don't text him back too soon, it advises women to delay pleasure indefinitely, because nothing so sharpens desire as delay. Modern translation, edge your heart for eternity. Here's the wild thing. All this swooning, all this aching, is happening in a culture where actual physical sex is still heavily policed, especially for women. Virginity is currency. A marriage is an economic alliance. A noblewoman's body is a vault for her family's legacy. But inside the rigid shell of marriage, courtly love becomes a fantasy escape hatch, a way to feel something, anything, even if it has to stay imaginary. And for men, it's a paradox. You're expected to burn with desire but never act on it, to prove your devotion by suffering, to fight duels over glove-dropping incidents and write sad songs about wrists. Love is torture, and torture is noble. It's like someone took emotional masochism and made it fashionable. Meanwhile, outside the castles and courtly poetry circles, peasants are living entirely different lives. There's no time for love triangles or metaphor-laden glances when you're trying not to freeze to death. Sex among the working class is usually quick, practical, and not nearly as dramatic. People marry for survival. They have children to help with labour, and while affection exists, of course it does, it's not adorned with flowery language or elevated to myth. But even in those lower ranks, the ripples of courtly ideals spread. Songs and stories travel. A girl hears a tale about a knight dying of heartbreak, and starts to wonder if her feelings for the miller's son are proof of a secret noble soul. A boy hears a ballad about a lady who waited 30 years for a single kiss and thinks, well, that sounds awful, but also kind of beautiful. Your quirky fact of the night. The Virgin Mary herself becomes the ultimate courtly lady in some poems. That's right. Poets take the structure of secular courtly love and apply it to religious devotion. Jesus becomes the pining knight, and Mary is the beloved lady, perfect and unreachable. It's a collision of eros and agape that makes you blink twice. But it works, at least for the poets. For them, all desire can be redirected into worship, into longing without sin. Scholars debate whether courtly love was ever truly practiced, or just written about by bored noblemen with too much parchment. Some say it was an emotional outlet for people trapped in arranged marriages. Others say it was a literary game, a coded language for expressing feelings no one dared to live out loud. Either way, it's clear that courtly love wasn't about sex. It was about the absence of it, and the unbearable beauty of wanting what you're forbidden to have. As the sun sets, you watch a noblewoman descend a spiral staircase, her dress trailing like spilled ink. She walks past the knight who loves her. He doesn't speak. He just bows, his eyes filled with silent agony, which is apparently the correct emotional response for this time period. She acknowledges him with a half smile that's been practiced in front of a mirror. The moment lasts less than 3 seconds. He'll write 6 pages about it later. You lie down that night in a corner of the stone keep, near a window where the wind sighs like a character in a badly written sonnet. Somewhere below, the troubadour is singing again. You can't tell if his song is about God or a woman or both, but the melody aches in a way that's oddly familiar, because here, sex isn't forbidden, it's suspended, trapped in the space between 2 verses or 2 glances or 2 people who will never ever touch. And in that space, people build cathedrals of longing. They live whole lives devoted to the art of not getting what they want, and somehow the absence becomes more powerful than the act. The love is never real, but the ache, that part is. The air is sharp now, almost metallic, carrying the scent of wet stone, burning torches, and the faint copper tang of fear. You're not in a castle or monastery anymore. You're in a village somewhere in late 16th or early 17th century Europe, and the shadow of hysteria hangs heavy over everything. This is the era of witch hunts, moral panic, and wet sheets nightmares, when sexual repression has metastasized into paranoia. Here, sex is both omnipresent and impossible, imagined as evil, destructive, and sometimes downright supernatural. And yet, everyone's still doing it. The contradiction hums in the air like a swarm of angry bees. You wander past crooked houses, mud walls blackened from smoke, and peek into a darkened church where the priest reads from a thick leather book. His voice trembles as he recounts the sins of lust, fornication, and the devil's attempts to seduce the faithful. Women are shivering in the pews, clutching prayer beads. They've been warned repeatedly. A single impure thought can summon demons, bring disease, or doom the village. Even men, supposedly safer from temptation, walk around with their collars tight and their eyes downcast, because everyone knows that looking at the wrong body, or the wrong glance, could mark them as guilty. And then you see her. A widow, maybe in her 30s, standing at the edge of the crowd. Her husband died 2 years ago. She owns land. She knows herbs. She speaks frankly to neighbours about childbirth, fertility and healing. And now everyone is staring at her like she's already half in hell. Because in this time, female knowledge of sex is dangerous. Midwives, herbalists, and even women who simply express desire are suspected of consorting with the devil. You feel it in the village. Fear is sexualized. Power is sexualized. Life itself has become a moral battleground where bodies are weapons, and women's bodies are the epicenter. Now you follow a group to the town square. A woman is dragged out, accused of sleeping with a demon. They spread wet sheets on the cobblestones to prove her guilt. The test is absurd. If she floats, she's possessed. If she sinks, she's innocent. Either outcome is terrifying because punishment can come regardless. It's a spectacle, a public ritual, a brutal morality play. And sex, or the suspicion of it, is always the stage on which the drama unfolds. Desire is a weapon, a crime, a curse, and a marker of morality. Here's your quirky historical fact. In some areas of Germany and England, accused witches were pricked with needles to locate the devil's mark, a spot where sexual sin had supposedly manifested physically. Blood, of course, was a sign of guilt, because nothing says moral panic like stabbing women to prove they've been having sex with spirits. The line between sexual imagination and punishment is gone. Fear is the law, and law is weaponized lust. Yet despite all this paranoia, people are still having sex, secretly, illegally, behind doors, in barns, in the shadows of forests. The peasantry cannot survive without it, and the nobles cannot resist it. Affairs, adultery, and clandestine encounters are everywhere, and when they're discovered, punishment is swift and spectacular. And naturally, it's always the woman who pays the highest price. Men are rarely executed for sexual impropriety unless it crosses some arbitrary threshold of scandal. The scholarly debate is messy, as always. Some historians argue that witch hunts were primarily political and economic, and that sexual panic was just a convenient excuse. Others insist that the fear of female sexuality was central, baked into theology, folklore, and law. Probably both are true, and standing here, watching the terror in villagers' eyes, you feel the weight of centuries of control pressing down. Sexuality framed as sin, women framed as danger, desire framed as chaos. By evening the square is empty but for torches and the lingering scent of smoke. The accused woman has been taken away screaming softly. You sit on a cold stone step and realise something. In this world, sex has become monstrous. It is no longer communal or sacred or even pleasurable. It is dangerous. It is frightening. It is powerful enough to summon death or damnation. The very act of desire can be lethal, and yet human bodies remain wired to want, to seek, to touch. As the wind whistles through the village, rattling the shutters, you lie back on the step, trying to imagine a world where sexuality isn't something you fear with every heartbeat. For the first time, you understand just how much repression can warp everything, from law to religion to daily life. And in the quiet, wet, cold darkness, you realise that even in fear, desire persists. It always persists, no matter how many wet sheets, needles, or sermons try to snuff it out. You step away from the terror of the village and find yourself by a crackling fire deep in the woods. The smell of pine and smoke is sharp, earthy, grounding. You're no longer among terrified villagers or moralizing priests. Instead, you're sitting with a small circle of Native Americans, somewhere in what is now the northeastern United States, long before European contact, around 1500 CE. And here, everything feels different. Relaxed, sacred, intimate, but not in the way Europeans imagined it. Sex is not hidden. It's not sinful. It's part of life, part of ceremony, and deeply communal. Not personal, but meaningful. You watch a young couple moving through the village preparing for a coming-of-age ceremony. It's subtle, ritualized. not voyeuristic. Elders observe from a distance, but no one shames, judges, or punishes. Instead, sex is intertwined with spirituality and social responsibility. The act is understood in a context of balance, of community, of family, of respect for the natural and spiritual worlds. Pleasure exists, yes, but it's integrated into a larger rhythm of life. Here you learn that certain societies practiced forms of communal education about intimacy. Adolescents might be guided by older mentors to understand desire, consent, and fertility, not shame, fear, or punishment. Sexual activity is framed as a skill, a duty, a gift to the community. You notice the contrast with the European worlds you've just left. No hysteria, no witch hunts, no doctrinal judgment. Just observation, instruction, and respect. And yet, the boundaries are clear. Not all acts are communal. Certain rites are private, sacred, or restricted to specific members of the tribe. But even then, secrecy doesn't carry shame. It carries reverence. Sex, like hunting, like prayer, is part of the web of survival and culture. And the point is clear. It's not about individual ownership or personal gratification. It's about maintaining harmony, both social and spiritual. Your quirky fact for this section: among some tribes, the spirit of intimacy could be invoked in dances and songs, sometimes resulting in ritualized sexual expression that strengthened social bonds. These weren't orgies as outsiders imagined them. They were coordinated, sacred expressions of fertility and connection. Anthropologists debate whether these ceremonies had erotic elements intentionally, or whether the erotic aspect was incidental to ritual. Either way, the community framed it as entirely normal and entirely necessary. You sit near the fire and listen to stories of the past, how bodies and spirits are interwoven, how sexual energy is neither sinful nor personal, but a thread in the tapestry of life. You see women and men moving together, teaching, learning, laughing, touching without fear, without shame. Even disagreements or jealousy are mediated through counsel and ritual, not through punishment or ostracism. In these cultures, the body is a vessel of knowledge. Desire is a resource. Pleasure is a tool. You notice how different this feels from Europe, where bodies are battlegrounds and desire is a crime. Here, the body is celebrated and regulated for the good of all, not punished for the benefit of one institution. You realize that for the first time in your journey, sex is framed as something inherently human and social, rather than sinful, political, or mystical. The fire crackles into the night, shadows dancing across faces painted with clay and charcoal. Children lie nearby, listening, absorbing lessons of community, respect, and natural cycles. Couples move slowly in the distance, hand in hand or embracing softly, observed but not judged, and you lie back on the soft earth, staring up at the endless stars, feeling the quiet hum of continuity. Here, sex is neither private nor illicit. It's woven into the rhythm of existence, understood by the body, celebrated by the mind, and honoured by the tribe. You feel maybe for the first time a glimmer of balance, a sense that intimacy can exist without shame, without fear, without punishment. And in that understanding, you begin to glimpse what it might mean to have a body that belongs to the world, to life, to something greater than self, but not necessarily to you alone. The air grows warmer now, thick with dust, smoke, and the sharp scent of burning incense. You're in Africa, somewhere along the Niger River, around the 16th century, and the world feels alive in a completely different way. Here, sex isn't shrouded in sin or obsession. It's rhythmic, ceremonial, part of festivals, social life, and the spiritual pulse of the community. You walk into a village where drums beat steadily and the cadence moves through your bones. It's not private, it's communal, and you feel it instantly. This is a culture where the body itself is a connector between people, between generations, between humans and the divine. You notice that initiation ceremonies are coming soon for adolescents. These are rites of passage that blend storytelling, dance, and intimacy education. Sex is a natural subject, taught through guidance, symbolism, and sometimes direct demonstration. The elders speak openly about fertility, desire, and the responsibilities that come with adulthood. They teach that sexual energy is powerful and must be respected. Yet there's no shame, no guilt, no moral panic. In this society, intimacy is integrated into social harmony, rather than policed by fear. In one corner of the village, A young couple dances with the rhythm of the drums, their movements synchronized with those of their peers. Every gesture is deliberate, expressive, meaningful, communal. It's not purely erotic, though pleasure is present. The act is a blend of celebration, instruction, and social bonding. Every touch carries meaning beyond itself, reinforcing relationships, lineage, and societal structure. You realize how radically different this is from European experiences you've seen, where bodies are punished, controlled, or idealized in ways divorced from everyday life. Here's your quirky historical fact. Among some West African societies, certain fertility dances involved symbolic representations of sexual acts, using rhythm and body movement to transmit knowledge to the community. These ceremonies were considered essential for agricultural success, social cohesion, and spiritual protection. Scholars still debate whether the sexual symbolism was intended to be literal or primarily metaphorical, but either way, the community took it seriously. You notice how women move confidently among the men, guiding, instructing, and participating in the rituals with authority. They are not passive vessels, they are educators, leaders, and holders of knowledge. Their sexuality is recognized as vital to the community's survival and spiritual health. In some cases, matrilineal structures mean that inheritance and family ties flow through the mother, further reinforcing the power and autonomy of women in these sexual and social frameworks. In the evenings, the village gathers around fires, telling stories that mix humour, spirituality, and moral instruction. Elders recount the legends of ancestors, gods, and spirits, weaving in lessons about respect, intimacy, and communal responsibility. You see young couples listening closely, absorbing patterns of behaviour, learning about sexual ethics in a way that's practical, visible, and tied to everyday survival. This is education by participation, not punishment. And yet, despite the openness, boundaries remain. Sexual behaviour is always understood in the context of duty, respect, and social balance. Acts that violate community norms, such as deceit, coercion, or disrespect, are addressed swiftly, often through ritualized mediation rather than punitive law. Consent and mutual understanding are culturally codified, even without written legislation. As night falls, you sit near the fire and watch a ceremony wind down. Children are led to sleep, couples retreat to private spaces, and the elders close the circle with chants of gratitude and protection. The village pulses with life. Sex, desire, and intimacy are woven seamlessly into the social fabric. There's pleasure, yes, but it's inseparable from responsibility, ritual, and community. For the first time, you feel a model of human intimacy that balances individual experience with collective well-being, a stark contrast to the fear, shame, and rigid rules you've witnessed in Europe. You lie back on the warm earth, listening to the drums fade into silence, and realize that in this part of the world, sex has never been only personal. It's a bridge, linking body to spirit, individual to community, present to past. And for the first time, you glimpse an intimacy that is fully human, fully social, and fully sacred, without ever being possessive. The scent of tatami mats, sandalwood, and rice stalk smoke fills the air as you step into Japan during the Edo period, around the 17th century. The world feels contained yet fluid, a delicate lattice of rules, social rituals, and hidden pleasures. You're in a city where wooden houses with sliding doors line narrow streets, and lanterns sway gently in the evening breeze. And here, as in every place you've travelled, sex is everywhere. But again, not personal in the modern sense. It's structured, performative, and often a tool for navigating society. You enter a tea house discreetly tucked between merchant homes. The scent of green tea mixes with incense, and the faint perfume of oil from women's hair. You see oiran, high-ranking courtesans moving gracefully along raised platforms. They are skilled in music, poetry, calligraphy, and conversation. Their sexuality is cultivated, choreographed, and acknowledged as a form of artistry. A client, always male, always formal, is here to learn, to observe, to pay tribute. Pleasure exists, but it is ritualized, almost like a performance that blurs lines between education, entertainment, and devotion. The courtesans' lives are paradoxical. They are highly respected for their skills, influence, and ability to move in both cultural and social spheres. Yet they remain bound by contracts, social expectation, and the power of those who pay for their company. You notice how every gesture, the tilt of a fan, a bow, the way hair is combed, is loaded with meaning. Even a casual glance can communicate consent, interest, or rebuke. Here, sexual expression is a language. Not private, not intimate in the personal sense, but highly potent. You follow a young man learning the codes of interaction. He bows before the courtesan, recites a carefully memorized poem, and is allowed a momentary touch of her sleeve. No more, no less. The unspoken rules govern not just behaviour but social order. Pleasure is subordinated to etiquette, hierarchy, and subtle power exchanges. A misstep can be socially catastrophic. Yet within these strictures, creativity, elegance, and emotional resonance flourish. Here's your quirky fact. Some Edo period texts advised men on bedroom health and sexual longevity, blending Taoist sexual philosophy from China with local practice. They encouraged men to prolong intercourse without ejaculation, believe in the spiritual transmission of energy, and value the woman's pleasure as part of balancing yin and yang. It's remarkably sophisticated, showing that even when sex is performative and socially structured, it is also deeply tied to philosophy, body awareness, and well-being. But not everything is performative. Outside tea houses and the elite circles, regular people maintain marriages that mix affection, pragmatism, and practical survival. Young couples work the fields together, raise children, and engage in intimacy within the household. Desire exists here too, but it's guided by necessity, duty, and social norms. Extramarital encounters are managed discreetly, not with public shaming as in Europe, but often through subtle negotiation, gifts, or ritualized visits. You see men attending yukaku, the licensed pleasure districts, where brothels are regulated by the state. Women work with the knowledge of legal protections, tax obligations, and the understanding of social order. Sex is structured by law, economy, and etiquette, but personal desire rarely dictates behaviour. Here, the individual's pleasure is secondary to performance, hierarchy, and societal rhythm. At night, you walk along narrow canals, the reflection of lanterns shimmering in the water. A couple passes, holding hands briefly, laughing softly, disappearing around a corner. It's fleeting, tender, human, but almost invisible in the larger choreography of Edo life. And that's the lesson here. Even when sex occurs, it is rarely private or purely personal. It is bound to ritual, education, hierarchy, and social harmony. You sit on the edge of a wooden bridge, listening to the distant murmur of the city. The air is cool, the water mirrors the stars, and for the first time, you feel the elegance of intimacy that exists without obsession, fear, or shame. Here, bodies are respected as instruments. Pleasure is a language, and desire is cultivated, guided, and refined. It is communal, functional, and sacred in its own subtle way, reminding you again that the story of sex is never just personal. It is woven into the fabric of society itself. You step off the lantern-lit streets of Edo and find yourself on a ship crossing the Atlantic, somewhere in the early 18th century. The air smells of salt, tar, and the faint anxiety of both sailors and passengers. You've arrived in the age of colonialism, when European powers are carving up the world, exporting not only trade and conquest, but also a whole new set of rules about sex, morality, and hierarchy. And just like the ships that carry men and women across oceans, intimacy is transported, regulated, and politicized, but rarely personal. In a colonial settlement, the first thing you notice is control. European settlers bring strict codes of behaviour, especially around sexual conduct. Laws dictate who can marry, who can own property, and who may engage in intimacy, and penalties are severe. Women are particularly policed. A single act outside marriage can result in public punishment, exile, or even execution. Men, in contrast, enjoy relative freedom, particularly if they hold status or military power. Sex is a tool to enforce authority, organise society, and maintain the so-called purity of European bloodlines in foreign lands. You walk through a trading fort and notice how colonial officers and settlers interact with indigenous populations. Marriages between settlers and local women are often discouraged or outright forbidden, but unofficial sexual relationships are rampant. Concubinage, coercion, and exploitation are common. The system ensures that European men retain power, and local women's bodies are subjected to both desire and control. Pleasure or consent is secondary. Function, hierarchy, and domination are primary. Meanwhile, in the household of a wealthy settler family, Life is carefully monitored. Husbands and wives maintain appearances, children are educated, and sex, if it occurs, is primarily reproductive. Letters reveal frustration, longing, and occasional discreet intimacy. But the overarching priority is survival, economic gain, and social conformity. Romantic love exists only as a secret, fragile layer atop duty and regulation. The personal is subordinated to political, economic, and legal structures. Here's your quirky historical fact. Colonial powers sometimes passed laws prohibiting marriages between European men and enslaved African women, while simultaneously allowing sexual exploitation of those same women. Scholars debate the intent. Some say it was to prevent mixed offspring from claiming inheritance or status. Others that it was moral posturing for the European gaze. Either way, the system is chillingly methodical. Desire exists, but it is weaponized, recorded, and policed. In the bustling port city, you see sailors frequent brothels run by women who are both marginalized and necessary for social order. They serve not only as sexual partners, but as vital outlets to regulate male energy, prevent unrest, and enforce class and racial boundaries. Men pay for access, and women perform a role that is socially sanctioned but tightly constrained. Intimacy is transactional. Bodies are property. Pleasure is permitted, but only in controlled doses. Even among indigenous populations, the presence of colonial laws and missionaries begins to reshape sexual norms. Practices that were once communal, spiritual, or educational are now labelled immoral. Shame is imported along with the church and the crown. Desire becomes a liability. Sexuality, once fluid and socially integrated, is now surveilled, categorized, and punished. The tension is palpable. Bodies want what they will, but society insists on strict obedience. By nightfall, you stand on the pier, watching ships' lanterns flicker across the water. The wind carries cries, laughter, and the occasional song from taverns along the waterfront. Everywhere you look, sex is present, among sailors, colonists, enslaved people, and indigenous partners, but it is shaped, restricted, and politicized. Rarely, if ever, is it personal in the way we now imagine it. It is a tool for survival, power, and social control, and every act is framed by the systems that surround it. You sit on a crate, letting the salt wind whip across your face. In this world, sex is both abundant and constrained. Pleasure exists, but only within boundaries set by status, law, and conquest. Desire is never private. It is a means of maintaining hierarchies, a weapon of the state, and a constant reminder that the body can be controlled, observed, and used. And as you stare at the dark water stretching endlessly before you, you realize that personal intimacy, the kind that is just yours, is still something rare, fragile, and almost forbidden. The clatter of gears, the hiss of steam, and the smell of coal greet you as you step into the Industrial Revolution, somewhere in England around 1850. Factories tower over the streets, chimneys spit black clouds into the sky, and the rhythm of labour replaces the rhythm of nature. And with this new world comes a strange separation. Sex, once embedded in survival, ritual, or social harmony, is now increasingly divorced from everyday life. Work dominates the body, and intimacy becomes a private, almost guilty affair, lurking in back rooms and candlelit corners. You wander through a crowded factory floor, weaving between rows of women hunched over spinning machines, men sweating at looms, children barely taller than the machinery. The air is thick, heavy, and stifling. Bodies are instruments of production, measured in output, endurance, and efficiency. Pleasure, desire, almost irrelevant here. The mind is for management and calculation, the body is for labour. And even when people seek intimacy, the exhaustion of the workday makes it fleeting, mechanical, and often perfunctory. Outside the factories, Victorian social codes dictate behaviour with an iron grip. Marriage is functional, keeping families intact, maintaining property, and reproducing labourers for the next generation. Women are idealised as chaste angels of the home, their sexuality suppressed in the name of morality and respectability. Men, by contrast, may have acceptable extramarital outlets, mistresses, brothels, or casual encounters, but these are compartmentalised to protect the sanctity of the domestic ideal. Desire is policed, gendered, and separated from personal fulfillment. You visit a bustling urban street where advertisements for newspapers, parlours, and gentlemen's clubs hint at hidden pleasures. Prostitution thrives in shadows because working-class men and women find ways to claim intimacy when the structures of respectability deny it. Brothels, bordellos, and illicit rendezvous are essential to the social economy. They regulate desire, prevent social unrest, and maintain the illusion of domestic purity. Sex becomes industrialized, like everything else, organized by class, geography, and commerce. Here's your quirky fact. Victorian manuals for sexual health often recommended intricate exercises to control desire, particularly for men, claiming that ejaculation too early could deplete vital energy. Some even prescribe mechanical devices, herbal tonics, and tedious regimens to preserve vitality. Science, morality, and fear of decay intertwine. Scholars debate whether these guides reflect genuine medical knowledge or social anxiety dressed up as science. But either way, they show a culture obsessed with managing desire. Meanwhile, courtship rituals evolve into formalized constrained performances. Young women are chaperoned, meetings between potential partners are brief, and even flirtation is a carefully regulated art. A blush, a glance, or a smile is measured for propriety. The personal thrill of intimacy is replaced by social signaling and negotiation. Romantic desire, when expressed, is a tightly codified performance, not spontaneous connection. Even within marriage, sexual expression is uneven. Husbands are encouraged to seek pleasure for the purpose of reproduction, but wives are meant to endure, moderate, or even suppress desire. Contraception is limited, knowledge is restricted, and shame pervades the domestic bedroom. The body becomes a site of duty rather than exploration. Emotional connection is possible, yes, but personal pleasure is largely subordinated to social expectation. As night falls, you wander along cobblestone streets lit by gas lamps, hearing the distant whistle of factories and the low murmur of crowded tenements. You glimpse couples in brief, secretive embraces, women touching the edges of desire while trying not to defy propriety, men seeking escape from the mechanical grind. Sex persists, but it is now privatized, compartmentalized, and burdened with guilt. Intimacy is fragmented, isolated, and mediated by social expectation, labour, and morality. You lean against a brick wall, the smoke stinging your eyes, and feel the profound shift. In the industrial city, sex has become disconnected from ritual, community, or spirituality. Bodies are productive first, intimate second. Pleasure is constrained, desire is disciplined, and the personal ownership of one's own sexuality, something taken for granted in modern imagination, is still largely inaccessible, mediated by class, gender, and the relentless machinery of industrial life. The faint smell of cigar smoke and heavy velvet greets you as you enter a dimly lit parlour in late 19th century Vienna, around 1890. You're reclining on a chaise surrounded by walls lined with books, framed etchings, and the quiet tension of unspoken desire. This is the age of Freud, of velvet gloves and corsets, of drawing rooms where every blush and sigh is catalogued, analysed, and interpreted. Sex has become a mystery to the mind, a subject of curiosity, obsession, and shame. And personal intimacy, once communal, ritualised, or functional, is now pathologized, dissected, and paradoxically everywhere. You watch as a young woman folds her hands neatly on her lap, the stiffness in her posture betraying the pressure of propriety. Across the room, a man adjusts his waistcoat, glancing nervously at the faint curve of her neck or the shape of her hand. They might be attracted to each other, but in this society attraction is mediated, constrained, and loaded with internalized guilt. Desire is a problem to solve, not an experience to enjoy. Even love, when it enters the room, is filtered through social norms and self-conscious awareness. The new intellectual obsession is the mind itself. Freud's emerging theories cast sex as a primal force underlying human behaviour, shaping thoughts, actions, and even neuroses. The individual is divided, conscious and unconscious, moral and instinctual, repressed and expressed. Every thought about desire, every fleeting attraction, is now subject to scrutiny. Your own impulses feel foreign under this lens, worthy of cataloguing, analysing, and possibly punishing. Pleasure is not private, but surveilled, first by society, then by the mind itself. You sit in on a lecture in a crowded salon. The speaker discusses hysteria, masturbation, and dreams. linking physical expression to hidden psychic conflict. The audience is rapt, alternating between horror and fascination. Women are described as particularly fragile, men as dangerously uncontrolled if left unchecked. Yet, the reality is that almost everyone in the room experiences desire, and many hide it, fear it, or channel it into socially sanctioned outlets. The personal experience of sexuality has become both inevitable and taboo simultaneously. A quirky fact emerges. Freud and his contemporaries often prescribe masturbation as both cure and illness, depending on context. One treatise suggests controlled sexual outlets to prevent hysteria in women, while another warns that overindulgence could deplete vital energy. Scholars still debate how much Freud's theories reflected actual observation versus the biases of his social class and gender assumptions. Either way, sex has been intellectualized to a level never seen before. It's no longer just behavior, it's a mental, moral and scientific puzzle, yet desire persists. In the streets of Vienna, young couples find discreet corners in gardens, alleys and theatres. Brothels flourish, offering sexual relief in exchange for payment and secrecy. The rise of urban anonymity allows some private indulgence, but always in the shadow of propriety and surveillance. Pleasure exists, but it's fragmented, mediated, and often fraught with guilt. Emotional intimacy is possible, but it must contend with layers of moral, social, and psychological expectation. Even within marriage, sexual interaction is tightly structured. Husbands and wives are advised by manuals, friends, and doctors about appropriate conduct, timing, and technique. Desire is acknowledged but managed. Female pleasure is theorized more than experienced. Men are taught to balance societal duty with personal instinct. Love is encouraged in theory, but the actual physical act is a negotiated, sometimes awkward performance. You wander the city at night, the street lamps casting soft halos on cobblestones slick with rain. You hear distant music from a salon, laughter from a tavern, and the faint sound of a whispered rendezvous. The modern individual has gained privacy and reflection, but lost spontaneity and naturalness. Sex is no longer fully communal or ritualized. It is introspective, regulated, and almost clinical in its approach. Desire has become a personal mystery, sometimes thrilling, often terrifying, and always under scrutiny. Leaning against a building, you inhale the wet air, smelling both the sophistication and the repression. Vienna has given sex an identity as a psychological phenomenon. It is not ritual, it is not communal, it is intensely personal, yet fraught with guilt, analysis, and moral policing. And in this delicate, confining new framework, you sense the first stirrings of the modern tension between pleasure and propriety, desire and conscience, intimacy and self-conscious observation. The rattle of marching boots, the acrid tang of gunpowder, and the faint metallic scent of hospital antiseptic greet you as you step into the Europe of the early 20th century, during the Great War. You're surrounded by trenches, barbed wire, and mud so thick it clings to your boots like a second skin. Here, sex is both omnipresent and nearly impossible, regulated not by moral codes or etiquette, but by circumstance, survival, and the machinery of the state. Desire becomes political, tactical, and sometimes a weapon, or a wound. You follow soldiers along the trench line. They sleep fitfully in dugouts, sharing stories, cigarettes, and brief touches of intimacy when opportunity allows. Sexual release is often clandestine. Brief encounters with fellow soldiers, letters to lovers at home, or fleeting visits to local brothels when leave is granted. Sex is no longer about romance, pleasure, or even personal choice. It is a release valve for stress, fear, and the relentless tension of constant danger. It is utilitarian, fleeting, and often guilt-laden. Civilians experience a different kind of intimacy constraint. Women manage households alone, coping with shortages, grief, and the constant uncertainty of whether their husbands or sons will return. The war's disruption of normal life means marriages are strained, courtship delayed, and sexual energy redirected towards survival. Desire persists, but it is mediated through letters, longing glances, and socially permissible fantasies. Passion exists in exile, in absence, and in imagination rather than in presence. Here's your quirky historical fact. During World War I, some armies issued condoms and distributed sexual health advice to soldiers. The rationale wasn't moral, it was logistical. Preventing sexually transmitted infections was critical to maintaining an effective fighting force. Pleasure, if permitted, was tactical. Consent was assumed only within controlled circumstances. Sex is not personal here. It is calculated, necessary and functional, an operational tool rather than a source of connection. In the cities, women and men navigate war-induced scarcity, loneliness and displacement. Relationships are compressed, transient or transactional. Soldiers returning on leave may seek intimacy wherever they can find it. Women may engage in temporary liaisons to secure protection or survival. Emotional connection exists, but it is overshadowed by necessity, logistics, and risk. Love is fragile, intimacy constrained, desire is present, but heavily mediated by survival imperatives. Even within marriage, the war alters sexual dynamics. Husbands away for months or years become strangers. Wives adapt, sometimes forming attachments that cannot endure official scrutiny. Letters home are coded, careful, and emotionally charged, often more intimate than the physical contact that occurs upon brief reunions. The personal nature of sex begins to emerge more clearly, yet it is entwined with anxiety, absence, and societal expectation. Scholars debate the long-term impact of the war on sexual norms. Some argue that the war accelerated modernization, loosening the grip of Victorian prudery and opening the door for more open discussion of desire and female sexuality. Others emphasize trauma, repression, and the normalization of transactional or utilitarian intimacy. Both are true, depending on class, geography, and circumstance. By nightfall, you lie on a damp bunk in a barracks, listening to distant artillery and the occasional groan of a soldier. Desire pulses faintly, tangled with fear, exhaustion, and longing. Here, sex is no longer purely communal or ritualized. It is functional, necessary, and fraught with moral and physical risk. Personal intimacy exists in fragments, through letters, fleeting encounters, and stolen moments, but it is never free of context or consequence. The war leaves bodies exhausted, psyches strained, and relationships tenuous. Pleasure is fleeting, connection is transient, and the individual begins to grasp a new kind of sexual reality, one in which desire is personal, yet constrained by forces far beyond the body itself. In the shadow of machine guns and mud, intimacy begins to feel private, fragile, and intensely human for the first time in centuries. The sun blazes overhead, warm and golden, and you suddenly find yourself barefoot in a field somewhere in California, 1969. The air smells of grass, sweat, and incense, and the sound of distant guitars drifts lazily across the horizon. You're standing in the middle of a crowd, 500,000 strong, and everyone is moving in the same rhythm. Human, chaotic, euphoric. Welcome to the summer of love. Welcome to an era where sex explodes into public consciousness, but not yet as personal as you might imagine. Here, intimacy is a revolution, a collective experience, a social statement, but it is still embedded in culture and community, not fully individualized. You wander among the young men and women sprawled across blankets, tents, and bare earth. Everyone wears flowers, beads, and hand-painted slogans like, "Make love, not war." Bodies brush together freely. Couples kiss, dance, and sometimes tumble into temporary partnerships that last a few hours, a few days, or a season. The logic here is radically different from previous centuries. Sexual expression is an emblem of freedom, rebellion, and self-realization. Yet even as sex becomes more visible, it is communal in its ethos. You participate, observe, and sense that intimacy is part performance, part social experiment, part political statement. In a circle near the stage, you watch as people share songs, poetry, and personal stories. Discussion of desire, sexual liberation, and consciousness-expanding experiences flows freely. Sexuality is no longer shamed. It is explored, articulated, and sometimes ritualized through music and group gatherings. Yet, for all its openness, there is still an underlying pressure to conform to communal ideals. Free love is encouraged, yes, but it is also a cultural performance. The personal element is not entirely liberated. It is entwined with ideology, group identity, and the search for spiritual or emotional connection. Quirky fact: some communes in this era experimented with partner swapping and non-monogamy as a form of social engineering. These practices were intended to break down possessiveness, jealousy, and the notion of ownership over desire. Anthropologists and historians debate the actual prevalence versus mythologized accounts, but the phenomenon underscores a key principle. Sex was still embedded in social experimentation, rather than fully private. Pleasure and intimacy were collective projects as much as personal acts. Outside the festival, conventional society looks on with horror. Newspapers report on promiscuity, drugs, and anti-establishment rebellion. Parents, politicians, and clergy decry the erosion of morals, yet within the crowd the energy is electric. Bodies entwine, hands touch freely, and laughter is abundant. Sex is normalized, celebrated, and explored in ways unimaginable to previous generations, yet it is still strongly social, an emblem of freedom through the community rather than isolated personal gratification. Even among couples who pair off, relationships are fluid, experimental, and temporally bound. Love may flourish, or not. Desire is explored as a form of consciousness expansion, rather than a contract or property. Monogamy is questioned. Emotional intimacy is encouraged, but it is experienced alongside communal rituals, group consciousness, and shared ideals. Desire is a learning tool, a form of connection, a political and spiritual act. Some scholars argue that this era marked a turning point, the first time sex was framed openly as a positive aspect of personal development. Others caution that it was still heavily performative, with peer pressure and ideology shaping what was considered desirable or acceptable. Both are true. You notice how sex here is celebrated, yet still negotiated through a framework of collective identity, rebellion, and spiritual exploration. As dusk falls, the crowd sways in unison to a distant guitar, bodies moving and laughing, smoke curling into the pink sky. You lie in the grass, smelling incense and sweat, and feel the first faint stirrings of intimacy, as a personal yet socially mediated experience. Sex is abundant, public and experimental, but not yet fully personal in the modern sense. Desire, pleasure, and connection are being reclaimed, but still as part of a broader social movement, a communal experiment in freedom, not a purely individual choice. The room flickers with the glow of a television set, casting a warm, artificial light on a small living room somewhere in suburban America, 1985. You sink into a well-worn couch, the faint smell of popcorn lingering in the air. The sounds of laugh tracks, jingles, and synthetic bass lines fill the space. Here, sex has entered the age of media, the era when intimacy, desire, and even romance are increasingly defined by screens, advertisements, and narratives broadcast into millions of homes. Personal experience begins to blur with mediated fantasy, and connection is simultaneously closer and more distant than ever before. You watch a primetime sitcom where married couples argue over trivial misunderstandings, flirt, and occasionally kiss with exaggerated drama. Nearby, a commercial touts a new perfume, implying that its fragrance will make anyone irresistible. Music videos feature suggestive choreography and sexualized images of young performers. Every channel, every frame, every storyline is saturated with sexual signaling, body language, clothing, voice, and gaze. Yet all of it is curated, scripted, and controlled. Sex is now a spectacle, an aspirational performance, and an object of desire delivered into the living room. But it is rarely personal in the sense of unmediated, autonomous experience. You flip the channel to a late-night talk show. The hosts joke about infidelity, dating, and sexual preferences. Callers ask questions about their partners, fantasies, and anxieties. The conversation is casual, even humorous, yet it reinforces norms and expectations. Intimacy becomes a matter of advice, representation, and media-mediated expertise rather than private lived experience. Pleasure is seen as consumable, teachable, and marketable. Your own desires are subtly shaped by what you watch and absorb. Taste, attraction, and sexual imagination filtered through popular culture. Here's a quirky historical fact. By the mid-1980s, erotic magazines, cable television, and early VHS tapes made pornography widely accessible to the public for the first time. Researchers debate the social effects. Some argue that exposure normalized desire and allowed private exploration, while others contend it commodified intimacy and distorted expectations. Either way, sex is no longer entirely private or ritualized. It It is now a media product, a spectacle, and a template for personal imagination. Meanwhile, dating culture is transforming. Teenagers navigate movies, music, and TV shows to learn what attraction should look like. Expectations are heavily influenced by mass media, often detached from lived experience. Boys and girls imitate gestures, language, and scenarios they see on screen, practicing desire in a semi-scripted way. Pleasure is codified, connection is performative, and social approval increasingly shapes personal expression. Even within private relationships, sex carries the imprint of media norms. Couples may model intimacy on films or songs, negotiating desire in ways informed by broadcast fantasy rather than authentic spontaneity. Love, passion, and desire exist, but they are constantly mediated, curated, and contextualized through an endless stream of images, narratives, and cultural standards. In a way, intimacy becomes a collective experience broadcast into personal life, rather than a purely individual exploration. You walk through a suburban street as neon signs flicker, television hums leak from windows, and distant laughter carries on the wind. Adolescents kiss behind parked cars, giggle over whispered references to shows, and navigate attraction with scripts half-learned from media. The personal ownership of desire is emerging, but it is intertwined with cultural cues, advertising, and collective imagination. Sex has become a mixture of private instinct and public guidance. As night deepens, you lie back on the roof of a garage, listening to the hum of the TV from inside, the city breathing softly below. Sex, desire, and intimacy are now everywhere and nowhere. They are mediated by screens, influenced by culture, and imagined through fantasy, yet they are still not fully personal. Connection is promised, curated, and performative. And in that quiet moment, you sense the tension building, the gap between collective spectacle and private fulfillment, the precursor to the next stage in the story of sex. The glow of a computer screen bathes your face in cold blue light, and you realize you're in a bedroom somewhere in the 1990s or early 2000s. The faint hum of a dial-up modem rattles in the background, punctuated by the occasional beep of an incoming email. You've entered the age of the internet, a moment when sex begins to shift from communal, performative, or mediated experiences into something more instantaneous, anonymous, and widely accessible. The personal is emerging, but in a fragmented, hyper-mediated form. Connection is now at the click of a mouse, yet still tangled with technology, anonymity, and cultural expectation. You sit at the desk, logging into a chat room on an early AOL interface. The room is full of usernames, blinking cursors, and fragments of desire typed in hurried lines. You are hot, kick me or wanna meet. Conversations oscillate between flirtation, fantasy, and negotiation. Here, sexuality is interactive but abstracted. You don't see faces, you don't hear voices, touch is imagined, and yet, intimacy feels urgent. Personal boundaries are fluid, curiosity is boundless, and desire is democratized, but still constrained by the limitations of technology and the anonymity of text. Outside the digital space, physical encounters are influenced by what you see online. Pornography, chat rooms, and early dating forums create a template for sexual behavior and expectation. Desire becomes codified through images, narratives, and textual exchanges. You notice teens and young adults negotiating attraction based on what they've read or watched, learning scripts that guide flirting, seduction, and sexual exploration. Intimacy begins to split. The body may act one way, the mind another, and desire itself exists simultaneously in real and virtual spaces. Here's your quirky historical fact. In the 1990s, webcam sex and early chatroom communities allowed people to explore fantasy across vast distances, long before social media made this commonplace. Some scholars argue this began a process of hyper-personalized sexual expression, while others warn that it fragmented intimacy, replacing real connection with curated or performative digital encounters. Either way, the internet created a landscape where sex could be experienced, explored, and imagined in new ways, often isolated from the social, ritual, or communal context that had historically structured it. You browse a forum thread where users share advice about relationships, sexual positions, and emotional connection. The knowledge is crowdsourced, constantly evolving, and unfiltered by traditional morality. Desire is no longer dictated by church, village, or state. It is now a personal project, shaped by peers, technology, and individual curiosity. Yet, paradoxically, the digital format also imposes new constraints. Performance matters, reputation matters, anonymity allows freedom but can erode trust and authenticity. The personal emerges, but it is mediated, filtered, and contingent. Meanwhile, physical sex often follows digital encounters. People meet for brief hookups arranged online, often transactional and intensely focused on immediate pleasure. Relationships may form or dissolve with equal speed. Connection is experiential but ephemeral. Pleasure is privatized, quantified, and negotiable. Love, if it appears, must navigate the flood of images, expectations, and rapidly shifting social norms. Desire is increasingly individualized, yet mediated by culture, technology, and peer influence. As night falls, you stare at the blinking cursor on the screen, thinking about all the other screens lighting up bedrooms, dorms, and offices around the world. Each one is a portal to desire, exploration, and fantasy. Intimacy can now be immediate, anonymous, and intensely personal, but also fragile, performative, and mediated. Sex is no longer just communal, ritualized, or moralized. It is being remade in the image of the individual. You lean back in your chair, letting the soft hum of the computer fade into silence. Here, the personal begins to dominate, but it is still shaped, filtered, and constrained by technology, culture, and mediated expectations. The digital world gives unprecedented freedom, yet also fragments intimacy, making connection both possible and precarious. Desire is now portable, negotiable, and constantly evolving. And in this moment, you sense the beginning of the modern sexual landscape. Personal, yet never entirely private. The soft glow of your smartphone lights up the room, and you realize you're now in the era of apps, dating platforms, and instant messaging, somewhere in the 2010s. Notifications ping like distant drum beats, each one a potential connection, a flirtation, or a fleeting moment of desire. You scroll through profiles, swiping left and right, weighing pictures, bios, and emojis. Sex has become a digital marketplace, hyper-accessible yet mediated, immediate yet often detached. Personal intimacy is theoretically abundant, but in practice, it is filtered through algorithms, performance, and the endless scroll. You notice patterns emerging everywhere. People curate their profiles carefully, highlighting attractiveness, wit, and desirability, while suppressing the messy human aspects of connection. Desire becomes gamified, attention quantified in matches, likes, and replies. Flirtation is rapid-fire and performative, intimacy distilled into a series of choices and approvals. The individual has unprecedented control over access to bodies, but at the cost of real human engagement. Sex is personal, but paradoxically it is mediated through a digital lens that constantly reminds you of your separateness, your audience, and the rules of the game. You watch friends send messages, debating carefully how to phrase attraction without seeming desperate. Emojis, GIFs, and memes become essential language, subtle signals encoding flirtation, humour, and interest. Physical contact may be days or weeks away, yet desire exists in a vivid, interactive, and carefully managed space. Pleasure is delayed, performed, and often imagined. You sense that intimacy has become a choreography, orchestrated, deliberate, and filtered through cultural, technological, and personal constraints. Here's a quirky historical fact. Research shows that by the early 2010s, more than a third of adults in some countries had tried online dating, and hookup apps like Tinder popularized what some called the gamification of sex. Scholars debate whether these platforms increase personal empowerment and sexual freedom, or whether they create new forms of commodification, anxiety, and superficiality. Either way, they mark a turning point. Sex is intensely personal, yet mediated by the architecture of technology. In physical encounters following digital courtship, sex often mirrors the speed and efficiency of the platforms themselves. Hookups, casual encounters, and short-term relationships are negotiated with precision, often stripped of ritual, communal context, or historical structure. Desire is immediate, transactional, and experimental. Emotional connection may develop, but it is optional, contingent, and often secondary to performance, curiosity, or personal gratification. The body becomes a vehicle for personal exploration in an unprecedentedly private yet socially influenced landscape. Despite this, intimacy is still communal in a new sense. Social media amplifies approval, judgment, and visibility. Sexting, shared photos, and digital confessionals make private desire visible to peers, friends, and potential partners. Sexual expression is intensely personal, yet simultaneously public and performative, a paradox of modern connection. Pleasure is individualized, yet social feedback structures and algorithms mediate its expression. Desire is at once liberated and constrained. As you lie back, phone buzzing faintly in your lap, you realize that in this era, sex has fully entered the realm of personal choice, but always in dialogue with culture, technology, and social norms. The intimate and the performative coexist, intertwined, and often indistinguishable. The history of unpersonal sexuality, ritual, duty, repression, and mediation has converged here, giving the modern individual unprecedented access to pleasure, yet also unprecedented responsibility for self-curation, negotiation, and interpretation. You close your eyes, feeling the faint hum of Wi-Fi, the glow of the screen fading into darkness. Sex is abundant, personal, and digital, but still guided by structure, performance, and social feedback. Desire has become a project, a game, and an experiment simultaneously. And in this moment, you begin to see the fully modern condition, intimate, mediated, and undeniably personal, yet never entirely free from external pressures. The soft buzz of notifications is replaced by a quiet hum as you sit in a room somewhere in 2025. The air smells faintly of coffee, electronics, and a hint of hand sanitizer. You're in the era of hyperconnectivity, where sex, intimacy, and desire are more personal than ever, and yet mediated in ways your ancestors could never have imagined. Dating apps, social media, virtual reality experiences, and AI-assisted companions have created a landscape where sexual expression is both radically individualized and intertwined with technology, culture, and social feedback. You have unprecedented control over your body, your desires, and the ways you explore them, but you're never fully free from influence, expectation, or performance. You scroll through a dating app, swiping past hundreds of faces in a matter of minutes. Each profile is curated, filtered images, witty bios, careful presentation. You pause on one. A message comes in instantly. You type a reply, edit it twice, delete, and rewrite. Communication is deliberate, rapid, and performative. Desire is distilled into symbols, emojis, and carefully chosen words. Pleasure is mediated not only through physical encounters, but through anticipation, imagination, and technology. Even intimacy begins digitally, often before bodies meet. It is personal, yes, but in a new, digitized sense, structured by algorithms, social norms, and cultural pressures. Virtual reality and AI are changing everything. Some people explore sexual experiences with avatars or digital partners, pushing boundaries of consent, fantasy, and desire. Scholars debate whether these experiences enhance personal exploration or distort human connection. Some argue that VR sex allows for safer experimentation, empathy, and understanding of boundaries. Others warn that it fragments desire, making intimacy performative and self-contained. Regardless, the trend is clear. Sex is being fully individualized, often independent of physical proximity, yet deeply integrated with technology, culture, and self-expression. Meanwhile, real-world encounters have evolved alongside digital intimacy. Hookups, long-term relationships, polyamory, and casual dating coexist fluidly. Consent is foregrounded, communication is constant, desire is negotiated in ways impossible a century ago. Physical pleasure is available but always contextualized within a network of social, cultural, and technological influences. The personal dimension of sex has reached a height never seen before, but with that freedom comes complexity, responsibility, and subtle pressure. Here's a quirky fact for this era. AI-powered sex robots and virtual partners have prompted debates over ethics, emotion, and the boundaries of personal intimacy. Some view them as tools to explore sexuality safely and creatively. Others worry they might erode human connection an expectation of mutual consent. Scholars, ethicists, and futurists continue to argue whether these technologies expand or contract the definition of personal sexuality. You glance around your environment, earbuds buzzing, laptop glowing, phone vibrating with notifications. Everything is connected. Everything is observable, curated, and mediated. The act of sexual exploration has never been more personal in terms of choice, agency, and access, but it is also entwined with algorithms, social expectations, and technological systems. Your desire is both yours and a reflection of the platforms, communities, and networks that structure it. As night falls, you lie back in bed, the city humming faintly outside the window. You think about the long history you've traversed, from tribal rituals and sacred marriages, through European repression, Victorian codification, war, and the digital revolution, to this current landscape of intimate choice. Sex has finally become personal in a way that is immediate, autonomous, and exploratory, but it carries the weight of culture, technology, and social mediation. The body is your own, yet never fully disconnected from the systems that surround it. You close your eyes and feel the soft tension of possibility, the freedom to choose, the freedom to explore, the freedom to connect. And you realize something profound. For the first time in human history, sexuality is largely personal, self-directed, and experiential, yet inseparably intertwined with culture, community, and technology. Desire is yours, but always in dialogue with the world, and in that balance you glimpse what it truly means to have sex as a personal, living, modern human experience. Looking back across millennia, you realize the journey of human sexuality has been anything but linear. From the ritualized communal practices of Paleolithic tribes to the sacred ceremonies of Mesopotamia and India, sex was initially a tool for survival, spirituality, and societal cohesion. It was not personal. Your pleasure, identity, or desire mattered little in comparison to the demands of community, lineage, or cosmic alignment. Across civilizations, bodies were instruments, symbols, and vessels for forces larger than the self. Even in cultures that celebrated intimacy, such as West African or Native American societies, sexual expression was closely tied to communal structures, teaching, and social responsibility. As you travel forward in time, repression emerges. Medieval Europe, with its witch hunts and moral strictures, transforms sex into a source of fear and shame. Desire is policed, women are punished, and intimacy becomes a battlefield of morality rather than pleasure. Yet even here, traces of personal expression survive, subtly threaded through forbidden glances, secret letters, and coded gestures. By the Industrial Revolution and the early 20th century, sexual expression begins to diversify, mediated by work, war, and the growth of urban life, but remains constrained by social, economic, and cultural frameworks. The late 20th century introduces mediated sexual culture. Pornography, television, and eventually the internet transform intimacy into something simultaneously immediate and performative. Sexuality begins to shift toward the personal, yet is filtered through media, technology, and social expectation. By the 21st century, hyperconnectivity, dating apps, and digital platforms allow unparalleled autonomy, giving individuals unprecedented control over desire, pleasure, and intimacy. Personal sexual agency reaches its height, but even now, it exists within a complex lattice of cultural, technological, and societal influence. The story of sex, then, is one of evolution from the communal and ritualized to the deeply personal and self-directed. Pleasure, intimacy, and connection are now framed as individual experiences, but they remain intertwined with the world around us. In understanding this arc, you see the extraordinary human journey, from bodies as vessels to desire as regulated to pleasure as personal, and the ways in which culture, technology, and community continue to shape what it means to be intimately human.